They told you pain was private, a mistake to be buried, an atomized shame that belongs in the dark. They taught you to swallow it, to tidy it like a wound under a sleeve, because visible hurt is leverage for others. But here's the thing, there is a different grammar to suffering, one that predates social media and sympathy. It's older than law, older than the polite lies we tell one another at dinner. It's the grammar of consequence, of psychological architecture, and of strategic silence. Machiavelli wrote about power as if it were a game of tides, not violent for the sake of violence, but patient, engineered, inevitable. What I'm about to give you is not revenge as spectacle. It's revenge that teaches without noise, that bends the moral compass of the person who thought they had ruined you. It is the art of making them feel guilty for hurting you, and doing it in a way that leaves them the victim of their own conscience. Imagine a courtroom where the only witnesses are the small habits that made them cruel, the diverted gaze, the flippant word, the moment they chose convenience over connection. You will not shout, you will not smear. You will arrange facts and emotions so that when truth arrives, it lands on them like an unavoidable verdict. There's power in the slow accumulation of evidence. A lie exposed in daylight collapses. A pattern revealed over time becomes a character study. People don't just react to single events, they react to narrative. You will craft a narrative where the central character is not you, but their own conscience, and the supporting cast is memory, context, and the quiet dignity of restraint. Start by watching, not the loud, feverish watching of the person obsessed with payback. The quiet, surgical watching that records tone, timing, and small cruelty. The difference between a grudge and strategy is that the latter is precise. The man who dismisses your feelings is loud sometimes and tiny at others. He interrupts you when the witness of others is present, but later, when it's just you, he shrugs and laughs. The woman who manipulates makes promises like bookmarks she never intends to open. These patterns are punctuation marks. Keep them, store them like inventory. Your memory becomes a ledger, not for revenge, but for truth. There's a moral architecture to this. Guilt is not something you can inflict like a blow. It is a condition that grows when context changes and the person is left alone with their actions. Take historical politics for a moment, where power was not won with tweets, but with letters, salons, and calculated absence. Remember how a neglected ally, once shown the pattern of a leader's betrayals, becomes an avenger of his own memory. That's what you aim for. Don't accuse, reveal. Don't prosecute, illuminate. A leader who publicly humiliated a subordinate but privately relied on them would, over successive betrayals and documented gratitude in other contexts, eventually be exposed to himself by his own inconsistency. You're not handing him a mirror. You're rearranging the light so that his reflection reveals the cracks he tried to hide. Silence is an instrument. Used badly, it appears weak. Used deliberately, it becomes a constant reminder. When someone hurts you and expects a reaction, the easiest satisfaction is to deliver one. A confrontation, a public explosion, an accusation. Those are fireworks. They burn bright and then everyone goes home. The person who hurt you gets to claim martyrdom or to shrug and move on. Instead, choose silence that accumulates meaning. Become less available, not as punishment, but as measurement. When you step back, you create space where their actions have to echo against themselves. There's a classic political trick. The wronged statesman who responds with dignity makes the original injurer appear petty, even foolish. People instinctively align with composure because it's associated with moral authority. This is the paradox. To make someone feel guilt, you rarely need to make them feel shame in front of others. Instead, you must model an integrity that casts their behavior into relief. Let them rage in private. Let your calm be the gallery in which their portrait looks worse. Language matters, but not the accusatory language used to bully or to humiliate. It's the soft, factual phrases that take the wind from justification. I noticed when this happened. I felt. These are not weak, they're precise. They invite self-examination rather than defensive posturing. People rarely hear hard facts when their armor is up, but they do hear a quiet sentence about how something made another human feel. A leader in Renaissance courts could dismantle an opponent simply by framing evidence in a human way. Not "you betrayed me," but "your promises meant something to me." That distinction tugs at the thread of empathy in everyone. Once the thread is tugged, a sweater unravels. You will use documentation as a weapon, but your weapon will be evidence, not theatrics. Keep texts, confirmations, small reminders of promises, not for a trial, but for the ledger you are building. Memory is fallible, paper is not. When the time is right, and timing is the second most important skill after restraint, produce a pattern so coherent that the person cannot plausibly deny it without appearing absurd. Real leaders and politicians have fallen not because of single misdeeds, but because of patterns that, when collated, tell a story that even loyalists cannot ignore. Your job is to collect those tiles until they make a mosaic too obvious to dismiss. There's also posture, the outward behaviors that make people turn inward. Move with measured intention. Speak with an economy that removes emotional bait. Wear a look that is not contemptuous but not solicitous either. Let your posture be the silent commentary that frames their conscience. People are constantly scanning for social cues. When you stop signaling resentment and instead signal your own worth through appearance, schedule, social presence, or simple attention to your own affairs, you create cognitive dissonance in the person who hurt you. They expect a collapse, instead they see flourishing. That dissonance nurtures guilt. It's a small daily victory to let your life be the quiet indictment. Now let's be clear about timing. Reveal too soon and you appear reactive. Reveal too late and their memory will have hardened into defense. The art is finding that window when a person is alone enough to think and public enough to care. A politician exposed during a scandal rarely admits the pattern until public opinion has shifted. But often, when allies start asking private questions, when curiosity becomes social pressure, the guilty party begins to feel the pinch. You must cultivate those private inquisitions without appearing to orchestrate them. Seeds, not shovel. Share your truth with people you trust, not to rally an army, but to seed doubt in a social group. When multiple small, independent threads of observation begin to converge in the periphery of someone's life, guilt grows like a mildew, unseen at first, then unmistakable. Empathy is not your enemy. It is your tool. If you want someone to feel guilty, make them understand the human cost of what they did, not just the inconvenience. Tell them the story of the night you lay awake, of the small practical harms that rippled outward because of their decision. Avoid dramatics. Focus on specifics that are relatable. People often fail morally because they fail to imagine consequences beyond themselves. By describing the concrete fallout, the lost opportunity, the ruined trust, the small daily indignities, you force them to hold the future they helped wreck. That's when guilt stops being an abstract moral judgment and becomes a personal ledger. Let history teach you. Think of cases where power was reclaimed not by screaming, but by stories. There are leaders who retired with their dignity intact because they allowed their enemies' actions to define them. The enemies then lived under the weight of their own choices. There are diplomatic maneuvers where a country's refusal to overreact exposed the aggressor's bad faith. In each example, the restrained party converted a moment of injury into a long-term moral imbalance. Instead of trading punches, they traded perception. You will do the same on a human scale. Negotiation is a field where this technique is priceless. When someone hurts you in a negotiation, by breaking a promise, by taking advantage of your generosity, the strongest move is to recalibrate the terms calmly. Reframe the deal in ways that expose the inconsistency. Say, we agreed on X, you delivered Y, I adjusted my side. How do you intend to reconcile that? This is not passive aggression. It's accountability dressed in clarity. It forces the other person to reckon with their breach as a practical problem they must solve, rather than an abstract moral failing they can deny. Once they are solving the practical issue, they are also confronting their failure to hold up their part. That is where guilt lives. There is a particular rhythm to the conversations you will choose. Short, precise, and factual is the drumbeat. Long, emotional monologues are the fireworks that benefit the abuser. They provide moral cover. Keep your sentences clean and direct. When you describe the harm, avoid rhetorical inflation. The person who precipitated it will instinctively downplay, but when the harm is framed in simple, unarguable terms, you promised X on this date, this is what happened, denial looks weak and guilt looks inevitable. You're not trying to make them suffer, you're trying to make them see. But don't mistake this for a moral crusade. There is a threshold of dignity you must not cross. If your aim is to destroy their life, or to humiliate publicly for the sake of spectacle, then you have become the cruelty you once suffered. What you are shaping is consequence that is proportionate and instructive. The person must be left with the opportunity to change, to repair. Guilt is not a cudgel, it is a mirror. The most Machiavellian rulers understood that a reformed enemy is more valuable than a ruined one. Sometimes the greatest victory is when the person who hurt you returns to you different, chastened, useful. That transformation belongs to the rarest, most disciplined application of these techniques. You must also prepare for the counterattack. People who act without conscience often project aggressively when faced with evidence. They will accuse you of manipulation precisely because you are asking them to be accountable. Anticipate this and disarm it with transparency. When you have documented and presented your case with calm, their accusation of manipulation falls flat, like someone who yells fire in a library. When chaos is your opponent's instinct, your calm will look like truth. There will be times when legal or formal recourse is the right path. If the harm crosses into theft, abuse, harassment, or actionable damage, take the necessary steps. The method I describe is not a substitute for safety or justice. It is a complement for the moral and social dimensions that law leaves cold. In communities, in the private corridors of influence, social truth often moves more efficiently than legal instruments. You will harness both where appropriate, without conflating them. Practical leadership tactics weave into this naturally. A leader who has been undermined can expose an underminer not by public humiliation, but by institutional clarity. Reassign responsibilities, document procedures, and make the consequences of repeated breaches part of the system. When the person's behavior causes measurable harm to operations, the record itself creates pressure. Leaders who do this do not appear vindictive, they appear principled and effective. In the long run, the group judges harm in terms of impact, and impact cannot be denied once it's quantified. There's a psychological turn you must understand. Guilt is most potent when it is private. Public shaming often produces shame resistance and tribal defense, but private introspection is where convictions change. So wherever possible, arrange scenarios that allow them to encounter their actions alone. A handwritten note, a private conversation, a small but factual summary that forces them to read and reflect without an audience. The person who reads a concise recounting of their behavior in solitude experiences a different thing than the person exposed publicly. They must face themselves without the theater of defenders. Remember, the goal is not to coerce confession through pressure. The goal is to create conditions in which conscience becomes unavoidable. That is done by lowering the noise, raising the clarity, and letting time be your ally. Imagine a river. The loud waterfall collapses into a pool. The patient channeling over months wears grooves into rock. You will be the channel. Finally, let me leave you with the ethic that must undergird all of this. Power without restraint becomes petty. Strategy without principle becomes mere cruelty. Use these techniques not to inflate your vengeance, but to restore your equilibrium. When someone hurts you, you deserve redress. You deserve to be seen and to have the record set straight. What you don't deserve is to become the mirror of the harm done to you. The most profound revenge is the one that returns dignity, yours and potentially theirs. The person who crushed you must be given the chance to feel the weight of their action, and through that weight, to transform. So arrange your silence like architecture. Collect your evidence like a patient historian. Speak in details, not declamation. Withdraw presence to invite reflection, not to punish. Let your life stand as the quiet indictment, and when the time is right, let truth arrive not as a shout, but as a simple, undeniable fact. In that moment, guilt will be less an emotion you impose and more a consequence the other person will claim for themselves. They will live with it, they will unpack it, they will be changed by it, or they will be exposed by it. Either way, you will have shifted the moral ledger back toward you, not by the loudness of your anger, but by the precision of your restraint. There is a final, almost poetic cadence to this work. The person who harmed you learns the lesson not through pain you dole out, but through the quiet proof of their own inconsistency. They come to recognize that what they did was small when it was big, and big when it was small. The ache of that recognition is the most honest kind of justice. It leaves no scars you have to tend. It gives back to you what matters most, the knowledge that you chose the harder, rarer path, to hold your ground without losing yourself. That is where power rests and where the truest kind of revenge, one that educates rather than destroys, quietly lives. Here's what most people never understand until they've lived through it. Guilt doesn't come from punishment, it comes from contrast. The contrast between who someone believed they were and what they realize they've done. Between the story they told themselves about their decency, and the image reflected back when you no longer fit inside that story. You don't need to twist the knife. You only need to hold up the truth long enough that their reflection becomes unbearable. That's the essence of Machiavellian revenge, not cruelty, but control over perception. And perception, when wielded with patience, becomes the most elegant form of power. Let's break that open. Every human being operates on two levels: the private self, fragile, insecure, defensive, and the public self, that polished version they project to survive among others. When they hurt you, they do it from the private self but justify it with the public one. The two selves remain in harmony as long as no one exposes the gap. Your silence, your composure, your quiet withdrawal, that's what forces them to see the split. It's like turning on a light in a room they've lived in for years. Suddenly, they notice the dust on everything. That light is you, no longer explaining, no longer begging to be understood, simply existing as a reminder of what decency should have looked like. History repeats this pattern endlessly. Think of Talleyrand, the French diplomat who survived revolutions and empires by mastering the art of subtle guilt. He never raised his voice, never threatened outright. When someone betrayed him, he'd treat them with immaculate courtesy, remind them gently of their own words, and then watch as their credibility dissolved. He understood that guilt, once seated, doesn't need tending, it grows on its own. The key is to make people see their contradictions and let their pride do the rest. Pride is an unstable element. When confronted by a truth too heavy to ignore, it either mutates into guilt or shatters into denial. Either way, they're disarmed. Now think psychologically. Guilt isn't born in the moment of wrongdoing. It's born in reflection when stillness replaces motion. That's why people numb themselves with distraction after they've hurt someone. They post more, drink more, joke more. They fill the silence before it begins to speak. Your job is to remove the noise they rely on. How? By not participating. Don't argue. Don't defend. Don't fill in their narrative gaps. Let them sit with the absence. It's an ancient social reflex. When communication disappears, humans instinctively search for cause. The silence itself becomes a mirror. But make no mistake, this isn't about ghosting or sulking. It's about emotional discipline. You must remain visible enough to be undeniable, but distant enough to be unreachable. That's the sweet spot where their guilt brews. They see you thriving, growing, becoming someone new, but they can't access you anymore. Their mind begins to connect the dots. Was it something I did? Why do they look lighter without me? Why does their calm bother me? That cognitive dissonance eats at them. The more composed you become, the heavier their conscience feels. It's human nature. People measure their goodness by the peace of those they've affected. When your peace expands, their illusion of goodness contracts. Let's talk about persuasion, because this is where dark psychology merges with Machiavellianism. There's a persuasion principle called implied contract. It's not what you say that shifts someone, it's what you allow them to infer. For instance, if someone accuses you unfairly and you respond not with rage but with measured calm, they unconsciously compare their chaos with your control. That contrast triggers a primitive discomfort. They begin to question their own righteousness. It's the same mechanism cult leaders and negotiators use, but inverted. Instead of seducing, you awaken. Instead of planting belief, you plant doubt in their story, not yours. And guilt grows best in the soil of doubt. It's slow, quiet, corrosive. It eats away at the self-image like rust under paint. The more they insist they were right, the more the gap widens between who they want to be and who they actually were. That's why Machiavelli always warned rulers against unnecessary cruelty. Not because he valued morality, but because cruelty breeds instability. A person who feels justified in cruelty can sleep easily. A person forced to see their cruelty without excuse will never sleep soundly again. You are not punishing them. You are destabilizing the story that allowed them to harm without conscience. It's not always personal either. This principle works in politics, negotiation, leadership, everywhere power and perception collide. Take Abraham Lincoln, a man who weaponized guilt without ever lifting a sword. When his generals disobeyed, he didn't explode. He wrote letters, calm, deliberate, devastating letters, outlining how their decisions cost lives. Many of those letters he never even sent. He just let them circulate privately, creating an aura of quiet disappointment. The result, his subordinates worked harder not to fail him again. That's the genius of moral gravity. People fall toward it. They feel the pull of integrity even when it hurts. You can do the same in your world. When someone hurts you, don't explain endlessly. Don't justify your withdrawal. Simply live in a way that exposes the gap between their treatment and your worth. When others notice, when the social ecosystem begins to whisper, the narrative turns. The one who hurt you becomes the one who lost someone good. That sentence, "they lost someone good," is guilt crystallized. It's social proof of moral failure. No lecture could ever match the sting of that. But here's where most people break the spell. They rush to prove they're okay. They post about healing, about moving on, about new beginnings. They talk too much. Don't. Let the silence speak for you. Mystery is the oxygen guilt breathes. When they can't read you, they project. And people don't project peace onto someone they've hurt. They project consequence. They imagine you remembering, thinking, judging. That's when guilt begins to haunt. You don't need to haunt them. Their imagination will do it for you. There's also the deeper layer, ethical dominant. In every human conflict, there's a moral ledger being unconsciously balanced. The one who appears to operate from clarity, from principle, eventually wins that ledger. Even those outside the conflict begin to take sides silently. If you remain steady, factual, and gracious, the social world tilts in your favor. This isn't luck, it's social physics. People are drawn to whoever looks least reactive, most self-possessed. Over time, even the one who wronged you starts to feel that imbalance. They begin to realize you gained moral ground without ever attacking. That realization is a quiet torment. It's Machiavellian revenge in its purest form, elegant, deniable, irreversible. Now take this to the realm of intimate relationships. Emotional guilt works differently there. It's not about logic, it's about loss. When someone hurts you and expects you to chase closure, you do the opposite. You become the absence they can't fill. You stop trying to explain your worth, you embody it. That's when guilt shifts from abstract to visceral. They start noticing small things, how their jokes land flat now, how your name makes the air feel heavier, how others speak kindly of you while they stay silent. Guilt in this sense is not a thought, it's a temperature. It changes the emotional climate they live in. But again, restraint is the rule. Never gloat. Never show satisfaction in their discomfort. Machiavelli would call that the fatal reveal, when power shows its hand too early. The instant they see you celebrating their guilt, it turns to resentment. You want it to mature into reflection, not revolt. So when they reach out, and they will, respond with kindness that feels earned, not eager. You're not forgiving to absolve them, you're forgiving to remind them of what they destroyed. True forgiveness is a mirror too clean to escape. They'll see their guilt reflected there more clearly than in your anger. The paradox here is that the stronger you become, the more guilty they'll feel, but only if your strength remains human. If you become arrogant, if you perform your healing as superiority, you shift from victim to adversary, and adversaries justify harm. That's the psychology of tribal morality. You must instead become something harder to categorize, calm, focused, untouchable, yet kind. That's when guilt becomes permanent, because they can no longer hate you without hating themselves. Let's look at one of Machiavelli's lesser-known observations. Men injure either from fear or from hate. What he didn't say explicitly, but implied, is that when the fear or hate dissolves, they're left face to face with their conscience. Your task is to remove both conditions. Stop fearing them. Stop hating them. When they no longer serve as emotional fuel, their cruelty loses context. Without that context, guilt takes its place. That's the silent revenge. You no longer need them to hurt for you to win. Consider the political art of non-retaliation. Gandhi, though not Machiavellian in morality, was Machiavellian in method. His nonviolence was not weakness. It was a strategy that forced the oppressor's conscience into the spotlight. Every beating, every arrest, every injustice magnified the oppressor's guilt by contrasting their violence with his calm. The same psychological mechanics apply on smaller scales. When you refuse to mirror cruelty, the cruel begin to self-destruct. They're forced to carry both their sin and your silence, and that's a weight most can't bear for long. But here's where your inner work matters most. Guilt doesn't always lead to apology. Sometimes it leads to disappearance. Some people will run from the mirror you hold up because seeing themselves clearly would destroy the narrative that keeps them functional. Don't chase them. Don't try to extract acknowledgement. That's not your reward. Your reward is the peace of knowing you didn't become them. The Machiavellian mind doesn't crave validation, it craves equilibrium. You win not when they admit guilt, but when their actions no longer dictate your internal weather. There's also a deeper psychological truth. People who feel guilty often rewrite history to survive it. They'll downplay, deny, even project blame. Don't correct them. The correction isn't verbal, it's existential. When your life moves forward in clarity and theirs remains tangled in justification, reality itself becomes your argument. Time becomes your advocate. Eventually, they'll have to look back, and what they'll see is not the fragile person they thought they could manipulate, but the calm, intelligent strategist who outgrew them without violence. That realization will do more damage than any confrontation could. So let them talk, let them rewrite. Let them explain you to others in whatever way helps them sleep. Because in the long run, every explanation will sound hollow next to your reality. The story they tell about you will wither in the light of what you become. That's the Machiavellian secret most people miss. Revenge doesn't require domination. It requires evolution. The person who harmed you expects you to shrink, to wither, to become a smaller version of yourself. When instead you expand, quietly, steadily, undeniably, you rewrite their crime as a chapter in your ascent. That's guilt's final stage, when the offender realizes their cruelty was the catalyst for your greatness. It's a guilt mixed with awe, the worst kind, because they can't undo it. That's how you make them feel guilty for hurting you. Not by punishment, not by performance, but by living so powerfully, so clearly, that your very existence exposes their mistake. You don't chase closure, you become it. And in the stillness of that realization, when they finally understand what they threw away, what they broke, and what you became, that's when guilt stops being emotion and turns into legacy. And now we arrive at the quietest, most dangerous phase, the aftermath. The point where they've begun to feel the weight, but you've stopped waiting for it. The world starts to realign around the truth. You're no longer acting with intention toward them, yet every move you make continues to haunt them. That's the paradox of true power. It's most effective when it's no longer deliberate, when your evolution becomes their punishment. Here's the thing, guilt doesn't just make people remorseful, it disorients them. They start revisiting the timeline, questioning which moment turned you from something familiar into something distant. They remember the day they dismissed you, the message they ignored, the conversation they thought they'd won. The brain hates loose ends. It tries to close the loop. But guilt reopens every loop they thought was sealed. And the more you grow, the more your existence becomes proof that they were wrong about you. Wrong about your weakness. Wrong about your limits. Wrong about what breaking you would do. That's why you must never step back into old dynamics, no matter how changed they seem. Because what they're seeking isn't redemption, it's relief. They don't want to make it right. They want to stop feeling the weight of it. But guilt is not a debt you owe them to forgive. It's a currency they must pay until they understand the cost. You're not their confessor. You're their reminder. Every time they see your name, hear your voice, or recall a moment of stillness where you didn't react, that's interest accumulating. Machiavelli would call this the economy of perception. He understood that every human interaction operates on invisible credit, respect, trust, loyalty. When one person violates that balance, they incur a moral debt. Weak people rush to forgive that debt in the name of peace. Strong people understand that peace built on imbalance rots from within, so you don't forgive quickly. You don't perform reconciliation for the crowd. You hold the silence until the other party realizes that peace is something they have to earn, not request. Now here's a deeper psychological truth. Guilt doesn't surface through confrontation, it surfaces through contract. The better you become, the worse they feel. But not because you've shamed them, because you've rewritten the narrative in a way that excludes them. That exclusion is lethal. Human beings are tribal creatures. We survive by relevance. When someone realizes they've become irrelevant in the story they once dominated, it shakes their identity. They start seeking proof they still matter to you, even negative. Don't give it, don't react. Don't post cryptic quotes or hidden messages. That's emotional charity and they don't deserve it. Let their imagination do the heavy lifting. In the Renaissance courts, the art of controlled absence was often more powerful than any speech. When a noble was betrayed, he didn't storm through the palace demanding justice. He simply withdrew his presence from certain gatherings. Slowly, people noticed his absence and then began to notice who replaced him. The traitor left in the spotlight looked exposed, desperate, overcompensating. The betrayed man became a mystery again, and in that mystery regained authority. You're playing the same game. Withdraw selectively. Your silence will become an atmosphere others can feel. At this point, something interesting happened. The person who hurt you starts to justify their actions publicly. They'll tell others how toxic you were, how sensitive, how distant. Don't interrupt this process. Let them talk. Every justification reveals one more layer of their insecurity. Every retelling makes them sound smaller. The the longer they cling to the story, the more obvious it becomes that they're still haunted. You've moved on, they're still narrating. And to everyone watching, that's proof of guilt. You'll notice over time how the energy shifts. Their laughter sounds forced. Their confidence falters when your name comes up. Even if they pretend not to care, their body language betrays the truth. That's the thing about guilt, it leaks through the smallest cracks. It shows up in tone, in timing, in avoidance. And if you've done your work, if you've truly detached, focused, rebuilt, you'll see all this with a strange kind of calm. You won't want revenge anymore. You'll just understand the justice that time delivers when you stop interfering with it. But let's not romanticize it. This kind of revenge, the silent, elegant kind, requires brutal discipline. You'll have nights where you want to scream, to call them out, to remind the world of what they did. You'll crave vindication, and that's the test. Because the second you break the silence to demand recognition, you give the guilt somewhere to go. You let them project it back onto you. You become part of the noise again. Don't. Instead, channel that emotion into creation, something tangible, something that proves you transmuted pain into art, purpose, discipline. Let your new life become the living cross-examination. The more you create, the more their story collapses. In psychological warfare, there's a term, reversal of narrative ownership. It's when the victim stops reacting to the aggressor's framing and begins defining reality on their own terms. That's what you're doing here. They tried to write your ending. You're writing your continuation. Every step forward, every improvement, every visible act of grace chips away at their version of the story. The more consistent you become, the more their narrative falls apart. That collapse is the loudest guilt of all because it forces them to realize they misjudged you, underestimated you, and in doing so, misjudged themselves. Think of historical figures who embodied this principle. Nelson Mandela, released after decades of imprisonment, could have weaponized vengeance. Instead, he weaponized composure. His refusal to hate his captors turned every one of them into a silent accomplice to their own moral defeat. His very presence became a mirror no one wanted to look into. That's the power of dignity when it's combined with restraint. It doesn't scream, it hums. And that hum drives people mad because it doesn't stop. In your case, the same thing applies. When you no longer defend your worth, it becomes self-evident. The person who hurt you can't escape that. Every good thing that happens to you, every win, every expression of confidence becomes another quiet indictment. They start to realize they didn't break you, they revealed you. And that's the kind of guilt no apology can fix. Eventually, they'll reach out. It may be a casual text, a comment, a nostalgic memory disguised as concern. Don't mistake this for remorse, it's reconnaissance. They're checking whether the spell still holds, whether they still occupy space in your mind. Your response should be minimalist, polite, uninvested. Never cruel. Cruelty signals unresolved emotion. Kindness signals sovereignty. You're not trying to punish anymore, you're maintaining the asymmetry. The more measured you are, the more they'll spiral internally. Because guilt, when met with grace, feels unbearable. If they push harder, if they confess, apologize, cry, accept it without theatrics. Don't give them absolution, but don't deny it either. Simply acknowledge it with the kind of quiet empathy that makes their words echo. I appreciate that. I understand. That must have been hard to realize. Short, disarming phrases that return the responsibility where it belongs. You're not the redeemer in this story. You're the constant, the one who stayed true to yourself while they wandered into lies. This is where Machiavellianism merges with transcendence. Because ultimately, the goal isn't to trap them in guilt forever. It's to free yourself from the need for it. Guilt is only satisfying as long as you need confirmation that you matter. Once you truly know you did, the need dissolves. That's when the revenge becomes complete, when their guilt continues but your peace no longer depends on it. You've created a one-way mirror. They see you, you no longer see them. And that's the thing about moral evolution, it's quiet. There's no applause, no cinematic closure. Just a shift in gravity. One day you'll wake up, think of them and feel nothing. Not anger, not longing, just neutrality. That's the summit. That's the point Machiavelli hinted at when he said a prince must learn to be both fox and lion. The lion is your strength, the fox is your silence. The moment you combine them, no one can touch you. Because here's what guilt eventually becomes: admiration. The same people who once dismissed you will speak of you with reverence they don't understand. They'll say they've changed, or they're doing well, as if you reinvented yourself out of thin air. They won't realize you became who you were always meant to be. They just never looked close enough to see it. Their guilt will soften into awe, and that's when you've transcended revenge entirely. You've turned your pain into mythology. The Machiavellian principle at the heart of this is simple. Never waste power proving power. The moment you prove it, you lose it. The more you let truth work silently, the more it becomes legend. And legends don't argue. They don't explain. They simply exist, and everyone else adjusts around them. That's what your silent revenge becomes, a gravitational field. People orbit it, even those who once walked away. Eventually, you'll notice something subtle. They start imitating you. The one who mocked your discipline becomes disciplined. The one who belittled your calm starts preaching serenity. They absorb your traits in an unconscious attempt to absolve themselves. They think by becoming like you, they can escape the memory of what they did to you. That's the final irony. Your existence reforms them. Your pain educates them. You didn't destroy them, you reshaped them. That's the highest form of vengeance, evolution, that forces others to evolve just to keep up. And so you return to your life steady, self-contained, untouchable. Not because you forgot, but because you've integrated the lesson. Every betrayal, every humiliation, every manipulation becomes data in your archive. You've learned not just how to see people, but how to read the architecture of power beneath every smile, every word. You've become a strategist in your own existence. Machiavelli would smile at that. He believed power wasn't about cruelty or kindness, it was about clarity. Seeing things as they are, not as we wish them to be. You've done that now. You've learned that silence can wound deeper than rage, that self-respect can indict louder than accusation, and that evolution is the only revenge that doesn't rot the victor. So let them carry the guilt. Let them perform remorse if they must. Let them rewrite, rationalize, and run. You don't chase ghosts. You don't need apologies to confirm what time already revealed, because the truth, your truth, has already done its work. It's not loud, it's not theatrical. It's quiet and it lingers, like a shadow that follows them long after you've walked into the light. And that's how you make them feel guilty for hurting you, by refusing to need anything from them ever again, by living so vividly that their absence becomes the only thing they can't ignore, by showing them without a single word that what they destroyed only freed you. That's not revenge, that's reclamation, that's transformation, that's power, the kind that never has to announce itself again.